Hello and welcome to Nighttime Biographies. On January 6, 1919, in a second-floor bedroom at San Juan Hill, a 60-year-old man lay dying who had never learned how to rest. Theodore Roosevelt, the youngest president in American history, the Rough Rider who charged up San Juan Hill, the trust buster who broke corporate monopolies, the conservationist who saved millions of acres of wilderness, was suffocating slowly from an embolism lodged deep in his lung. His wife Edith sat beside the bed, watching her husband of 32 years struggle for each breath. The doctors had warned her days ago that the end was approaching. Roosevelt's body, ravaged by decades of relentless activity, jungle fevers contracted in the Amazon, infections from a bullet wound that had never properly healed, was finally surrendering. Throughout that long day, Roosevelt drifted in and out of consciousness. When awake, he spoke quietly with Edith, making small jokes, asking about their children, refusing as always to admit defeat. He'd survived assassination attempts, tropical diseases, political betrayals, and the death of his first wife and his mother on the same day. He had led cavalry charges, hunted lions in Africa, explored unmapped rivers, and reshaped the American presidency into something unrecognizable from what he'd inherited. But the human body has limits, even for a man who spent his life refusing to acknowledge them. At 4:15 in the morning on January 6th, Edith woke to find Theodore breathing strangely. She called for a nurse, who immediately summoned the doctor, but by the time help arrived, Roosevelt had stopped breathing entirely. The doctor examined him and pronounced him dead. A blood clot had travelled from his leg to his lung, stopping his heart instantly. He was gone. Edith Roosevelt looked at her husband's face, finally at peace after 60 years of furious motion, and said simply, "It is as he would have wished it. He was ready." Consider the strangeness of what has just happened. A man who could not sit still for 5 minutes, who wrote 35 books while serving as president, who boxed in the White House and hiked through Rock Creek Park during diplomatic meetings, who believed that vigorous action was the cure for every problem, has died in his sleep. The man who famously said death had to take him sleeping, for if Roosevelt had been awake there would have been a fight, has slipped away without the battle he always craved. How does someone become Theodore Roosevelt? How does a sickly child who couldn't breathe, who spent nights sitting upright, gasping for air, transform himself into the embodiment of American vitality? How does a privileged New York aristocrat become a cowboy, a police commissioner, a war hero, and a president who terrified corporate titans? And what drove this ceaseless energy, this refusal to accept any limitation, this need to be perpetually in motion until the very moment his heart stopped? Before we begin this journey through one of the most extraordinary lives in American history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'm always curious where in the world you're watching from tonight, so please leave a comment and let me know. And now settle in as we travel back to October 27th, 1858, to a New York City very different from the one you know today. The New York of Theodore Roosevelt's birth was a city in transformation. The downtown remained a warren of narrow streets laid out in the Dutch colonial period, while uptown the grid system imposed in 1811 was slowly marching northward, bringing order to farmland and estates. Broadway was still partially cobblestoned. Horse-drawn omnibuses rattled along the avenues, gas lamps illuminated the streets at night, but most neighborhoods remained dark after sunset. The city's population had exploded to over 800,000, making it the largest metropolis in North America, but it was still possible to see farms and open land within the city limits. The Roosevelt family occupied the upper reaches of New York society. They were not new money, not strivers clawing their way up. They were old New York, as established as the Astors or the Vanderbilts, with a lineage stretching back to the Dutch settlers of New Amsterdam in the 1640s. The original ancestor, Clees Martensen van Roosevelt, had arrived in New Amsterdam around 1649. By the mid-19th century, his descendants had divided into two branches, the Oyster Bay Roosevelts, from whom Theodore descended, and the Hyde Park Roosevelts, who would later produce Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt Sr., the father, was a glass importer and philanthropist, a man of considerable wealth who devoted much of his energy to charitable causes. He was physically imposing, tall and powerfully built, with a thick beard and penetrating eyes. His friends called him Greatheart because of his generosity and his deep concern for the poor of New York. He founded the Children's Aid Society, worked with the Newsboys Lodging House, and personally visited the families of soldiers during the Civil War to deliver their pay. He was a man of action and principle, someone who believed that privilege carried obligations. Martha Bullock Roosevelt, Theodore's mother, came from a very different world. She was a Southern belle from Georgia, born into a plantation family that owned slaves. Her father, James Stevens Bullock, had been a wealthy planter. Her brothers would fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War, while her husband supported the Union cause. This created a painful division in the Roosevelt household, a tension that would shape young Theodore's understanding of loyalty, duty, and the complexities of family obligation. Martha was delicate, beautiful, and perpetually mourning for the lost world of her Southern childhood. She suffered from chronic headaches and stomach ailments, spending much of her time in darkened rooms. Her health was fragile, her disposition melancholic. Yet she possessed a storytelling gift that captivated her children. She would regale them with tales of the antebellum South, of her brother's adventures, of a world of honour and tradition that the war had destroyed. Theodore Roosevelt was born on October 27, 1858, in a brownstone at 28 East 20th Street in Manhattan. The birth was difficult. Martha laboured for many hours before the baby finally arrived, a tiny, struggling infant who seemed to fight for each breath from his first moments. They named him Theodore, after his father, though everyone would call him TD, until he reached college. The child was not healthy. Within weeks, his parents realized that something was wrong with their son's breathing. The episodes began mildly but grew progressively worse. Young Theodore would suddenly begin gasping for air, his small chest heaving, his face turning pale, then red, then almost blue as he struggled to draw breath into lungs that refused to open properly. The attacks came without warning, often at night. The family would wake to the sound of the child's desperate wheezing, and Theodore Sr. would rush to his son's bedside. What they were witnessing was severe asthma, though medical understanding of the condition in the 1860s was primitive. Doctors had various theories: hereditary weakness, nervous disposition, exposure to cold, but no effective treatments. The Roosevelt family tried everything: changes in diet, various medications, trips to the countryside for better air, consultations with specialist after specialist. Nothing worked consistently. The asthma attacks were terrifying for everyone involved, but especially for young Theodore. Imagine being 4, 5, 6 years old and suddenly unable to breathe. The panic that sets in, the primal fear that this time you won't be able to draw the next breath, the helplessness of feeling your own body betray you. Night after night, week after week, year after year, the attacks came. Theodore Sr. developed a desperate remedy. When the attack struck at night, he would bundle his son in blankets, carry him out to the carriage, and drive at top speed through the dark streets of Manhattan. The theory was that the rushing air and the motion would somehow help the boy breathe. It rarely worked, but the father kept trying, night after night, because doing something, anything, was better than sitting helplessly by the child's bedside watching him suffocate. These midnight carriage rides became one of Theodore's earliest memories, the gasping for breath, the cold night air rushing past, his father's strong arms holding him, the horse's hooves clattering on cobblestones. The message embedded itself deep in the child's psychology. When you cannot breathe, when death seems close, you do not surrender. You fight, you move, you act. The Roosevelt household on East 20th Street was crowded with siblings. Anna, called Bamie, was the eldest, born in 1855. She would become Theodore's closest confidant despite being partially crippled by a spinal condition. Elliot, born in 1860, was Theodore's younger brother and closest playmate in childhood. He was everything Theodore was not: naturally athletic, charming without effort, beloved by everyone who met him. And finally came Corinne, born in 1861, who would grow up to be a poet, and Theodore's lifelong supporter. The children were educated at home by private tutors. The Roosevelt fortune was sufficient that there was no need for public schooling, and Martha's frail health meant she preferred having her children near. The household was filled with books, and all the children were expected to read widely and well. Theodore proved to be a voracious reader despite his frequent illnesses. He would devour books about natural history, adventure stories, military history, anything he could get his hands on. But being sickly shaped everything about young Theodore's childhood. He could not run with other boys. He could not play rough games. He spent hours inside while healthy children played in the streets. The asthma made him weak, thin, and pale. His nearsightedness, which went undiagnosed for years, made the world a blur beyond a few feet. He was physically helpless in ways that tormented him. Other boys mocked him. There are accounts of Theodore at age 10 or 11 being bullied by boys his own age on a stagecoach trip. They tormented him mercilessly, and he could do nothing to defend himself. He had no strength, no ability to fight back. He simply had to endure until adults intervened. The humiliation of that helplessness carved itself into his memory. Young Theodore developed compensating strategies. If he could not be physically strong, he could be intellectually formidable. He memorized facts about animals, about history, about geography. He collected specimens, insects, rocks, small dead animals, and catalogued them obsessively. By age 9, he had established what he grandly called the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History, a collection of specimens stored in his room and various corners of the house. His long-suffering family tolerated finding dead mice in bureau drawers and animal skulls on the mantelpiece because they understood. This was how Theodore fought against his physical weakness. He wrote his first scientific paper at age 9. A careful study of insects he had observed. The prose was pretentious, the observations sometimes comically wrong, but the determination was genuine. Theodore might not be able to breathe properly, but his mind worked perfectly well, and he would make it into a weapon. But intellectual achievement could not fully compensate for physical weakness. The world of the 1860s and 1870s was brutally direct in its assessment of male worth. Physical strength mattered. The ability to fight mattered. Young Theodore understood this viscerally every time he gasped for breath, every time he was too weak to play, every time he faced mockery he could not answer with his fists. The turning point came when Theodore was about 12 years old. His father called him into the study for a conversation that would change everything. What was said in that room would become the founding myth of Theodore Roosevelt's self-creation, repeated in various forms throughout his life. Theodore Sr. looked at his pale, weak, brilliant son and delivered a message that was both encouraging and crushing. Theodore, you have the mind, but you have not the body, and without the help of the body, the mind cannot go as far as it should. You must make your body. It was a challenge and a command. The father was telling his son that intelligence alone was insufficient, that the world would not accommodate his weakness, that he must transform himself physically or remain forever limited. For some children, such a demand might have been impossible, a burden that would crush rather than inspire. But for Theodore Roosevelt, it became a mission. He seized upon the challenge with an intensity that would characterize his entire life. If his body was weak, he would make it strong. If he could not breathe, he would force his lungs to work. If he was helpless against bullies, he would learn to fight. His father installed a gymnasium on the second-floor porch of the house. It contained weights, parallel bars, a chest expander, and a punching bag. Theodore began a regimen of exercise that he would maintain, with obsessive consistency, for the rest of his life. Every day, regardless of whether he felt well or ill, he lifted weights. He did chin-ups until his arm shook. He swung wooden clubs. He punched the bag until his knuckles bled. The results came slowly. Muscle does not appear overnight on the frame of a chronically ill 12-year-old. For months, Theodore showed little visible improvement, but he did not stop. The determination that would later drive him to hunt lions in Africa, to charge up San Juan Hill, to break corporate monopolies was forged here, in daily confrontation with a weak body that refused to cooperate. He took up boxing lessons. His instructor was an ex-prize fighter named John Long, who taught the boy the fundamentals of the sport: how to stand, how to throw a punch, how to take a hit and keep fighting. Theodore threw himself into boxing with the same desperate energy he brought to weightlifting. He was not naturally talented. He would never be a great boxer. But he could be relentless. He could refuse to quit. The physical transformation was real but never complete. Theodore grew stronger, developed some muscle, learned to fight adequately. But the asthma never went away entirely. For the rest of his life he would suffer occasional attacks, though they became less frequent and less severe as he aged. The nearsightedness remained. The childhood illnesses had left him with a constitution that was robust in some ways but fundamentally compromised in others. What changed was not his body, not entirely. What changed was his mind. Theodore had learned that willpower could overcome physical limitation. That effort could transform weakness into strength. That surrender was never necessary. These lessons became the core of his identity. He would spend the rest of his life proving them over and over again, pushing his body past its limits, refusing to acknowledge pain or illness or danger. But this transformation came at a cost. The boy who had to make his body had no patience for those who would not make theirs. The man who conquered his asthma through sheer willpower would expect others to conquer their problems the same way. The relentless Roosevelt who emerged from this childhood would be inspiring to some, exhausting to others, and occasionally blind to human limitations that could not be overcome through simple effort. The Roosevelt family believed in travel as education. Throughout the 1860s and 1870s, Theodore Sr. took his family on extended trips to Europe and the Middle East. These were not casual vacations, but year-long expeditions designed to expose the children to art, history, languages, and different cultures. For a sickly child, the travelling was often grueling, but it was also transformative. In 1869, when Theodore was 10 years old, the family spent an entire year in Europe. They toured England, France, Switzerland, Germany, and Italy. Young Theodore kept a detailed journal, documenting everything he saw with the same obsessive attention to detail he brought to his natural history observations. He sketched birds and animals. He recorded the architecture of cathedrals. He noted the customs of the people they met. The journal reveals a mind that was constantly categorizing, analyzing, storing information for future use. It was during this trip that Theodore's terrible eyesight was finally diagnosed. He had been given a rifle to shoot on a hunting trip, but he could not see the targets his companions pointed out. Initially, they thought he was simply a poor shot, but eventually someone realized that the boy literally could not see clearly beyond a few feet. When he was finally fitted with glasses, the world came into sharp focus for the first time in his life. Theodore was astonished. "I had no idea how beautiful the world was until I got those spectacles," he later recalled. Trees had individual leaves. Birds had distinct feathers. People had facial features visible from across a room. The discovery was almost overwhelming. The glasses also transformed his ability to study natural history. Now he could observe birds in flight, identify species from a distance, and sketch specimens with accuracy. His collections grew more sophisticated. His journals filled with drawings that actually resembled the creatures they depicted. A second major trip followed in 1872-1873, this time to Egypt and the Holy Land. The family travelled up the Nile, visited pyramids and temples, and hired guides to take them through the desert. Theodore was 14 years old, and the trip awakened in him a love of adventure and exotic landscapes that would never leave. He shot and collected bird specimens throughout the journey, adding them to his ever-growing natural history collection. More importantly, he learned that he could endure physical hardship, that his rebuilt body could handle heat, difficult travel, and the diseases that came with exotic locations. But these travels also revealed Theodore's emerging personality, and it was not always attractive. He was arrogant about his knowledge, insufferable when he discovered an error in a guide's information, and utterly convinced of his own superior understanding of whatever subject he'd recently read about. He argued with his tutors, corrected his elders, and displayed a supreme confidence that had little basis in actual experience. The sick child had become a healthy adolescent, and the healthy adolescent was often obnoxious. His family tolerated this behaviour partly because they understood its origins. Theodore's intellectual arrogance was compensation for years of physical helplessness. His need to prove himself superior was rooted in having been so inferior. They loved him, and they made allowances. But not everyone would be so forgiving. By age 16, Theodore had transformed himself enough to consider college. The obvious choice was Harvard, the school that educated New York aristocrats destined for positions of influence. Theodore's father made inquiries, secured the necessary recommendations, and in the fall of 1876, Theodore travelled to Cambridge, Massachusetts to begin his university education. He was 17 years old, physically transformed from the gasping child of a decade earlier, intellectually confident to the point of arrogance, and utterly unprepared for what was about to happen to his sheltered, privileged world. Harvard in 1876 was an institution in transition. The old-style, classical education was giving way slowly to more modern approaches. Students still studied Greek and Latin extensively, but there were also courses in natural science, political economy, and modern literature. The student body was small by later standards, perhaps 800 undergraduates, and overwhelmingly drawn from wealthy families. It was a finishing school for America's upper class, a place where social connections mattered as much as academic achievement. Theodore arrived at Harvard with his carefully rebuilt body, his complete confidence in his intellectual abilities, and absolutely no social skills whatsoever. The transformation from sickly child to healthy young man had been achieved through willpower and relentless exercise, but nothing in his sheltered upbringing had prepared him for the social dynamics of college life. His classmates found him odd. Theodore talked incessantly, usually about subjects only he found interesting. He gestured wildly when he spoke. He had a peculiar high-pitched voice that would characterize him for his entire life. He carried himself with an intensity that was off-putting to the more languid sons of privilege who populated Harvard. When excited about a topic, which was most of the time, he practically vibrated with energy. He signed up for boxing, of course, and joined the Natural History Club. He took long walks through the countryside around Cambridge, collecting specimens and making observations. He studied diligently, earning respectable if not outstanding grades. But his real education was happening outside the classroom. Theodore was learning that the world did not automatically respect intellectual brilliance or physical determination. His classmates cared more about social connections, family background, and the right clubs than about his encyclopedic knowledge of birds. The privilege that had sheltered him all his life was not enough at Harvard. Here, all the students were privileged. What mattered was style, grace, the ability to fit in. And Theodore Roosevelt, for all his achievements, did not fit in. He joined the right clubs eventually, the Porcellian, the most exclusive of Harvard's social organizations. But membership came not from his efforts, but from his family connections. His father had been a member. The Roosevelt name opened doors. Theodore's personality nearly closed them again. But college also provided Theodore with something he had never experienced: genuine friendships with people outside his family. He formed bonds with several classmates who could see past his eccentricities to the genuine warmth and loyalty beneath. These were not friendships of convenience, but deep connections that would last decades. Theodore would prove to be a remarkable friend, generous, supportive, endlessly encouraging to those he loved. And then, in 1878, during Theodore's sophomore year, tragedy struck. His father died. Theodore Roosevelt Sr. had been everything to his son: hero, example, the standard against which all other men would be measured. He was only 46 years old. The cause was stomach cancer, though the family did not fully understand the diagnosis at the time. Theodore rushed home to New York, but he arrived too late. His father died on February 9th, 1878, before Theodore could say goodbye. The loss devastated him. Theodore would later write that his father was the best man I ever knew, a statement he would make repeatedly throughout his life. The death removed the central pillar of Theodore's existence, the person who had challenged him to make his body, who had shown him what it meant to be a man of principle and action. But the loss also did something else. It freed Theodore from the expectation that he would follow his father into the family business or into philanthropy. Theodore Sr. had been grooming his son for a life of gentlemanly charity and business management. Now that future was gone. Theodore would have to decide for himself what he would become. He returned to Harvard and threw himself into his studies with renewed intensity. He would excel. He would make something of himself. He would prove worthy of his father's memory. The grief drove him forward, as grief often did with Theodore. He would not sit with sadness. He would outrun it. It was in his junior year at Harvard that Theodore discovered his future wife, though he did not yet know it. Her name was Alice Hathaway Lee. and she was 17 years old, beautiful, blonde, and the daughter of a wealthy Boston banking family. Theodore met her at the home of a classmate and was immediately utterly, hopelessly smitten. Alice was everything Theodore was not: graceful, charming, at ease in social situations. She was athletic in the casual way of someone who had never needed to force her body into obedience. She rode horses beautifully, ice skated with grace, and moved through the world with an ease that Theodore, for all his self-improvement, would never quite master. Theodore courted her with the same relentless intensity he brought to everything else. He called on her constantly. He wrote her letters. He engineered situations where they would be thrown together. His pursuit was so intense that Alice's family worried he was frightening the girl. But Theodore was incapable of restraint. He wanted Alice, and when Theodore wanted something, he pursued it with every ounce of energy he possessed. Alice was less certain. She liked Theodore, enjoyed his company, found his intensity flattering if occasionally overwhelming. But she was not in love, not initially. She kept him at a distance, accepted his attentions, but made no promises. For perhaps the first time in his life, Theodore Roosevelt encountered something he could not achieve through sheer willpower. The courtship stretched through his junior and senior years at Harvard. Theodore graduated in 1880, intending to continue his natural history studies. He had already decided against following his father into business. His passion was science, specifically biology and natural history. He planned to become a professional naturalist, perhaps a professor, someone who studied and classified the natural world. But Alice Lee was not yet ready to marry. She did not reject Theodore outright, but she would not accept him either. Theodore spent the summer of 1880 in a state of emotional turmoil unusual for someone normally so decisive. He wrote in his diary in code, recording his feelings but disguising them even from himself. The entries from this period show a young man utterly vulnerable, terrified that the one thing he wanted most would be denied him. Finally, in the fall of 1880, Alice accepted his proposal. The reasons for her change of heart are unclear. Perhaps Theodore simply wore down her resistance. Perhaps she came to genuinely love him. Perhaps she recognized that his devotion was real and rare and worth accepting. Whatever the reason, she said yes. They married on October 27th, 1880, Theodore's 22nd birthday. The wedding was a grand affair at the Lees' Boston estate, uniting two wealthy families in the manner expected of their class. Theodore was delirious with joy. He had won. Through persistence and determination, he had achieved the seemingly impossible. Alice was his. The marriage began happily. Alice moved into the Roosevelt family home in New York, and Theodore enrolled at Columbia Law School, intending to pursue a legal career since his plans for scientific study had been set aside. But neither Theodore nor Alice were really suited for quiet domestic life. They were young, wealthy, and energetic. They wanted adventure. Theodore began spending time in the Adirondacks, hunting and exploring. He bought land in the Dakota Territory, the vast western region where cattle ranching was creating fortunes for Eastern investors. He talked endlessly about wanting to live a strenuous life, to test himself physically, to escape the softness of civilization. Alice indulged these plans, perhaps not fully understanding how serious Theodore was about pursuing them. And then, in 1881, Theodore made a decision that baffled everyone who knew him. He announced that he was entering politics. The decision to enter politics shocked Theodore's family and social circle. Gentlemen of their class did not go into politics in the 1880s. Politics was dirty, corrupt, beneath the dignity of respectable people. It was a realm of ward bosses and immigrant votes, of men who took bribes and controlled elections through violence and intimidation. Theodore's friends told him he was making a terrible mistake. But Theodore had already concluded that American government needed reform, and that reform would require men of his class to involve themselves in the machinery of power. He could not simply write essays about good government or donate money to reform movements. He would have to enter the arena himself to fight in the muck of actual politics if he wanted to change anything. He joined the local Republican Party organization in New York's 21st District and made himself available for the state assembly nomination. The party bosses looked at this earnest young man with his high-pitched voice and his spectacles and his obvious wealth, and they saw an opportunity. Roosevelt had money and social connections. He could be useful, perhaps controllable. They gave him the nomination. On November 8th, 1881, at age 23, Theodore Roosevelt was elected to the New York State Assembly. He would serve 3 one-year terms, from 1882 to 1884, and in those 3 years he would prove to everyone, his friends, his enemies, and himself, that he was nothing like what anyone expected. The New York State Assembly met in Albany, 150 miles up the Hudson River from Manhattan. The Capitol building was drafty, poorly heated, and filled with men who regarded the new assemblyman from Manhattan as a pampered rich boy playing at politics. They expected him to give a few speeches, vote as the party told him to vote, and return to New York City satisfied that he had done his civic duty. Theodore astonished them. He showed up early to every session and stayed late. He read every bill in detail, a practice almost unheard of among assemblymen who routinely voted on legislation they had never examined. He asked probing questions that revealed the corruption hidden in seemingly innocent bills. He identified conflicts of interest that everyone else pretended not to see, and he did all of this in his peculiar high-pitched voice, gesticulating wildly, his spectacles flashing, radiating an energy that was simultaneously irritating and impossible to ignore. The veteran politicians called him the Dude because of his fashionable clothes and aristocratic bearing. They mocked his voice, his mannerisms, his obvious inexperience, but they could not mock his effectiveness. Within weeks, Theodore had identified several corrupt schemes involving railroad companies and judicial appointments. He named names in speeches on the assembly floor, accusing specific politicians of accepting bribes and specific businessmen of offering them. This was not how politics worked. You were supposed to see corruption, understand that it was how things got done, and either participate or politely look away. You did not stand up in the assembly and publicly accuse people of crimes. Theodore did exactly that. He made enemies immediately. Powerful men who had controlled New York politics for decades suddenly found themselves under attack from this upstart. The press, which usually ignored the mundane business of the state legislature, began covering Roosevelt's speeches. Reform groups that had despaired of ever finding allies in government rallied behind him. Theodore discovered that he loved the fight. He was not always wise in his battles. He sometimes attacked people who did not deserve it, made accusations he could not fully prove, and displayed a righteousness that alienated potential allies. But his sincerity was undeniable. Theodore was not positioning himself for higher office or playing a political game. He genuinely believed that government should be honest, that public officials should serve the public, and that corruption should be exposed and punished. This naivete about politics, this belief that principles mattered more than pragmatism, was both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. In 1883, Theodore was re-elected easily. In 1884, he was elected for a third term. By his second term, he had become the minority leader of the Republicans in the Assembly, an extraordinary achievement for someone so young and inexperienced. He was learning how to build coalitions, how to compromise when necessary, how to count votes and advance legislation. But he never entirely lost his habit of righteous indignation when confronted with dishonesty. During these years in Albany, Theodore maintained his life with Alice in New York. They had moved into a house on West 45th Street, and Alice was pregnant with their first child. Theodore commuted between Albany and New York constantly, balancing his political career with his family life. Everything seemed to be falling into place. He was 25 years old, successful in politics beyond his wildest expectations, about to become a father. The future looked bright. And then, on February 12th, 1884, everything collapsed. Theodore was in Albany attending to assembly business when he received an urgent telegram from New York. His wife was in labour, and there were complications. He should come immediately. Theodore caught the next train, racing through the winter night toward New York City. The journey took hours. He arrived at his home early in the morning of February 14th, 1884. Two women lay dying in his house. Alice had given birth to a daughter the day before, but she was now in the grip of kidney failure, a complication of the pregnancy that doctors were helpless to treat. Upstairs, in another room, Theodore's mother Martha was dying of typhoid fever. The disease had struck suddenly. She had perhaps hours left. Theodore spent that long day moving between the two rooms, holding the hands of his wife and his mother as they slipped away. Alice barely regained consciousness. When she did briefly wake, she did not seem to recognize him. The woman Theodore had pursued for years, had won through relentless determination, was leaving him, and there was nothing his strength or his will could do to stop it. His mother died first, at 3 a.m. 11 hours later, at 2 p.m, Alice died in Theodore's arms. She was 22 years old. Their daughter was 2 days old. Theodore drew a large X in his diary for that day. Below it he wrote only, "The light has gone out of my life." The light had gone out, and Theodore Roosevelt discovered that willpower could not bring it back. For the first time since childhood, he encountered a problem that could not be solved through determination or effort. His wife was dead. His mother was dead. No amount of action could change that. The funeral was held on February 16th. A double ceremony, mother and wife together. Theodore stood through it in a state of shock. Afterward, he handed his infant daughter, named Alice after her mother, to his sister Bamie and fled. He could not bear to look at the child. Every time he saw her face, he saw his wife. Theodore's grief took a form that would have been unrecognizable to most people, but was entirely characteristic of him. He did not weep publicly. He did not speak of Alice, would almost never mention her name again for the rest of his life. Instead, he ran. He resigned from the assembly. He closed up his New York home. He left his daughter with Bamie without making any clear plans for her future. And in June 1884, just 4 months after the deaths, he boarded a train heading west to the Dakota Territory, to the ranch he'd purchased on a whim 2 years earlier. He would disappear into the wilderness and try to outrun the darkness that had swallowed him. The Badlands of Dakota were as far from New York society as it was possible to get while remaining in the United States. The landscape was harsh, broken country of steep buttes, deep ravines, and sparse vegetation. Summer temperatures soared above 100 degrees, winter cold dropped to 30 below zero. The only industry was cattle ranching, and even that was precarious. This was still wild country, where grizzly bears and wolves roamed freely, where outlaws hid from the law, where survival required genuine toughness. Theodore arrived at his ranch, the Maltese Cross, in June 1884. He was 25 years old, heartbroken, and desperate to lose himself in physical labour. The local ranchers took one look at this spectacled Easterner in his fancy clothes and assumed he was a wealthy fool who would quickly give up and return to civilization. They called him Four Eyes and made no secret of their contempt. Theodore understood their judgment and did not care. He had not come to the Badlands to impress anyone. He had come to disappear, to exhaust himself so thoroughly that he could sleep without dreaming, to fill the emptiness in his chest with the practical demands of survival. He threw himself into the work of ranching with characteristic intensity. He rode with the cowboys during roundups, spending 16 hours a day in the saddle. He helped brand cattle, enduring the heat and the dust and the smell of burned hide. He learned to rope, to ride through difficult terrain, to sleep on the ground under the stars, his soft hands blistered then calloused, his pale skin burned then tanned. His body, already strong from years of disciplined exercise, became harder. The cowboys watched this transformation with growing respect. Four Eyes could not rope as well as they could not ride as naturally, but he did not quit. When he fell off his horse, he got back on. When the work was difficult, he kept going. When other men were ready to stop, Roosevelt continued. They began to accept him, grudgingly at first, then genuinely. Theodore bought more cattle, investing heavily in expanding his ranching operation. He purchased a second ranch, the Elkhorn, built a ranch house there, and began living for extended periods in the Badlands. He wrote to his sister Bamie that he might never return to New York, might make his life permanently as a rancher. It seemed a possibility. The West was providing what Theodore needed, a place where his past did not follow him, where no one knew about Alice, where he could reinvent himself through action. He hunted extensively, pursuing deer, elk, and buffalo across the Dakota landscape. He shot a grizzly bear after a long, dangerous stalk, and he wrote about it with evident pride. The hunting was not sport in the casual sense. It was a way of testing himself, of proving that he could survive in conditions that would kill softer men. He also began writing. Theodore had always been a writer. His journals from childhood were voluminous. But now he started writing for publication. He wrote articles about his hunting adventures, about ranch life, about the landscape of the West. His first book, Hunting Trips of a Ranchman, was published in 1885. It combined his experiences with natural history observations and philosophical reflections on the meaning of the frontier. The prose was sometimes overwrought, but it captured something genuine about the experience of the western wilderness. The writing became a lifeline. Theodore could not speak about his grief, but he could write around it. In his descriptions of the vast empty landscape, the solitary hunts, the harsh beauty of the Badlands, there was a barely concealed emotional subtext. He was a man alone in the wilderness trying to find a reason to continue living. But the West, for all its therapeutic value, could not be a permanent escape. Theodore's money was invested in cattle ranching, and ranching in the Dakota Territory in the 1880s was a gamble. The open range seemed infinite, but it was finite. Too many ranchers were putting too many cattle on too little grass. The market was becoming oversaturated. A disaster was building, and in the winter of 1886-1887 it struck. That winter was catastrophic. The temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero and stayed there for weeks. Snow fell in massive quantities, then froze into a crust that cattle could not break through to reach grass. the animals starved by the thousands, standing frozen in drifts too weak to move. When spring finally came, the ranchers counted their losses and discovered that the open-range cattle industry had been essentially destroyed. Some ranchers lost 90% of their stock. Theodore lost most of his cattle and most of his investment. The ranches that were supposed to provide a livelihood proved financially ruinous. By 1887, it was clear that he could not make a living in the Badlands. He would have to return to the east, to a life he'd been trying to escape. But the West had accomplished something. Theodore had survived his grief. He had not overcome it. Grief like that never truly ends. But he had found a way to live with it. The physical challenges, the vast landscapes, the daily exhaustion had pulled him back from the edge. He was ready to return to civilization. In December 1886, even before the full extent of the cattle losses became clear, Theodore was already planning his return to New York. He had begun courting a woman he had known since childhood. Edith Kermit Carow had been part of Theodore's life forever. She grew up in the same Manhattan social circle, attended the same parties, knew the same people. She and Theodore had been close friends as children, and there had been a romance between them in Theodore's late teens before he met Alice. That romance had ended badly for reasons that remain unclear, and they had barely spoken during Theodore's Harvard years and his marriage to Alice. But after Alice's death, when Theodore was back in New York between trips to Dakota, he encountered Edith again. They renewed their acquaintance carefully, both aware of the complicated history between them. Edith was intelligent, reserved, practical, very different from the vivacious Alice. She understood Theodore in ways Alice never had, knew his moods, could manage his intensity. They married on December 2nd, 1886, in London. Theodore wanted the wedding to take place away from New York, away from memories of his first marriage. Only a handful of family members attended. Theodore's sister Corinne witnessed the ceremony. Theodore's daughter Alice, now 2.5 years old, was not present. She remained with Bangme in New York. The marriage to Edith marked Theodore's full return to civilized life. They moved into Sagamore Hill, a large house Theodore had been building on Long Island before Alice's death. It would be their family home for the rest of Theodore's life. Edith immediately brought order and management to Theodore's chaotic existence. She handled finances, managed the household, and provided emotional stability. Over the coming years, she would bear 5 more children: Theodore Jr., Kermit, Ethel, Archibald, and Quentin. But returning to domestic life meant Theodore needed a career. His ranching investments were lost. His inheritance was diminished. He needed work, and in 1889 an opportunity arose that would change his life again. President Benjamin Harrison appointed Theodore to the United States Civil Service Commission. The Civil Service Commission was not a glamorous position. It was a 3-member board tasked with enforcing civil service reform laws, ensuring that government jobs were awarded based on merit rather than political patronage. The position paid $3,500 a year and carried little power. Most people saw it as a backwater, a place for earnest reformers to spin their wheels while accomplishing nothing meaningful. Theodore saw it as an opportunity to fight corruption on a national scale. He accepted the appointment and moved his family to Washington, D.C. For the next 6 years, Theodore Roosevelt would make the Civil Service Commission into something it had never been: a genuine force for reform. He investigated violations personally, traveling across the country to examine hiring practices in federal offices. He found evidence of bribery, favoritism, and systematic violation of civil service laws. He wrote reports documenting these abuses in meticulous detail, and he gave interviews to newspapers, publicizing the corruption he uncovered. The party bosses who controlled patronage appointments despised him. Members of Congress complained about his aggressive investigations, but Theodore had public opinion on his side. Americans were tired of corruption, tired of watching government jobs sold to the highest bidder. Roosevelt's crusade resonated with a public ready for reform. President Harrison tolerated Roosevelt's zealotry, though not happily. When Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, won the presidency in 1892, everyone assumed Roosevelt would be fired. Instead, Cleveland, who was also a reformer, kept him on. Theodore had made himself indispensable by being willing to attack corruption in both parties equally. He was not a partisan warrior, but a genuine reformer, which made him rare and valuable. But by 1895, Theodore was restless again. He had spent 6 years investigating hiring practices and writing reports. He wanted more direct action, more immediate results. When a position opened on the New York City Board of Police Commissioners, Theodore seized it. He resigned from the Civil Service Commission and moved his family back to New York. New York City in 1895 was one of the most corrupt cities in America. The police department was particularly rotten. Officers paid bribes to get their positions, then extorted money from businesses to make back their investment. Prostitution, gambling, and illegal saloons operated openly under police protection. The department was more criminal enterprise than law enforcement. Theodore was appointed president of the 4-member police commission in May 1895. He was 36 years old and about to wage the most public battle of his career. Theodore started by doing something the previous police commissioners had never done. He went out at night to see if officers were actually doing their jobs. He walked the streets of New York in the small hours of the morning, dressed in a long coat and wide-brimmed hat, checking whether policemen were at their posts or whether they had abandoned their beats to sleep or drink or shake down businesses. He found officers asleep in doorways, drunk in saloons, extorting shopkeepers, found beats left entirely unpatrolled. The next morning these officers were brought before the commission and disciplined, sometimes fired. Word spread through the department. The new commissioner was serious and he was everywhere. Theodore also insisted on enforcing the Sunday closing law for saloons, a piece of legislation that had been on the books for years but never enforced. The law required that bars and saloons close on Sundays, the Sabbath. It was a reform measure designed to reduce drunkenness and give workers a day of rest, but it was wildly unpopular with working-class New Yorkers who viewed Sunday as their only day to socialize at their neighborhood saloons. Roosevelt did not care. The law was the law. If the public wanted the law changed, they should petition the legislature. But while it remained on the books, it would be enforced. He sent police raiding illegal Sunday saloons, arresting bartenders and proprietors. The crackdown created enormous resentment. Workers hated it. Immigrant communities felt targeted. The saloon owners organized opposition, and the political machines that had always protected illegal drinking saw their power undermined. The press had a field day. Theodore became a figure of controversy, praised by reformers and religious groups, condemned by working-class organizations and democratic politicians. He seemed to enjoy the attention, giving interview after interview, defending his actions, explaining that law enforcement meant enforcing all laws, not just the convenient ones. But Theodore's self-righteousness created problems. He alienated allies who might have supported other reforms. He made too many enemies simultaneously. The other police commissioners, initially supportive, began to turn against him. the infighting within the commission became public and ugly. By 1897, Theodore had accomplished significant reforms. The police department was measurably less corrupt, but he had also made his position untenable. He needed to leave before he was pushed out. Fortunately, a new opportunity appeared just in time. In 1897, William McKinley won the presidency, and Theodore's supporters lobbied for his appointment to the position of Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Theodore wanted the job desperately. He had been fascinated by naval history since childhood, had written a history of the War of 1812 that focused heavily on naval battles, and believed passionately that America needed a strong navy to become a world power. He was appointed in April 1897 and immediately began advocating for naval expansion and modernization. But Theodore's mind was on more than just building ships. He believed that war with Spain was coming, inevitable given the deteriorating situation in Cuba, and he wanted the navy prepared. The island of Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, was a Spanish colony in revolt. Cuban insurgents had been fighting for independence for years, and their struggle was receiving sympathetic coverage in American newspapers. The Spanish military response was brutal, and American public opinion increasingly favored intervention. Theodore was convinced that war was not only likely but desirable. It would give America an opportunity to demonstrate its power, to acquire overseas territories, and to join the ranks of true imperial powers. When the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898, killing 266 American sailors, Theodore saw his prediction confirmed. The cause of the explosion remains debated by historians. It was probably an accident, a coal bunker fire that ignited the ship's ammunition, but in 1898, most Americans assumed Spanish sabotage. "Remember the Maine" became a national rallying cry. War was declared on April 25, 1898, and Theodore Roosevelt, who had spent his entire adult life preparing for such a moment, did something that shocked everyone. He resigned his position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to volunteer for military service. His friends told him he was insane. He was 39 years old with a wife and 6 children, including baby Quentin, who was less than a year old. He had a prominent position in the government, a position where he could actually influence the war effort. Why would he throw all that away to become a common soldier? But Theodore had been preparing for war his entire life. All the physical training, all the hunting, all the boxing, it had been building toward this moment. He couldn't sit behind a desk while other men fought. He would go himself, or he would be exposed as a fraud, someone who talked about the strenuous life but refused to live it when the stakes were real. Theodore used his connections to secure authorization to raise a volunteer cavalry regiment. He recruited men from across the country, but especially from the West. Cowboys, miners, hunters, lawmen, men who could ride and shoot. He also recruited athletes from Eastern colleges, polo players and football stars, creating a unit that combined frontier toughness with Eastern education. The press called them Roosevelt's Rough Riders, and the name stuck. Theodore was commissioned as a lieutenant colonel, second in command of the regiment. He deferred to his commanding officer, Colonel Leonard Wood, a regular army officer with actual combat experience. But everyone understood that Roosevelt was the real leader, the magnetic personality that held the unit together. The Rough Riders trained briefly in Texas, then shipped to Cuba in June 1898. The chaos of the war effort became immediately apparent. There were not enough transport ships. The Rough Riders had to leave most of their horses in Florida. The supplies were inadequate, the planning was haphazard, but they were going to Cuba, going to war, and Theodore could barely contain his excitement. The first significant engagement came on June 24th, 1898, at Las Guasimas. It was a skirmish rather than a major battle, but it was Theodore's first experience of combat. Spanish troops fired from concealed positions in thick jungle. American soldiers died beside him. Theodore led his men forward under fire, directing their return fire, helping evacuate the wounded. The fight lasted perhaps 2 hours before the Spanish retreated. Several Rough Riders were killed, others wounded. Theodore wrote to Edith that evening that he had the time of my life. The letter reveals something essential about Theodore Roosevelt. He was not lying about enjoying combat. The danger, the chaos, the life-or-death stakes, this was exactly what he'd been seeking. The man who had spent his childhood unable to breathe was now in an environment where every breath might be his last, and he was exhilarated. The defining moment came on July 1st, 1898, at the Battle of San Juan Hill, though Theodore actually fought on adjacent Kettle Hill. The American objective was to capture the Spanish fortifications on the heights overlooking Santiago. The plan was simple. American infantry and cavalry would advance across open ground and storm the Spanish positions. The execution was chaotic. American artillery had mostly been left behind due to transport problems. The infantry advance bogged down under Spanish fire. Officers were killed. Units lost cohesion. The attack was failing, and men were dying in large numbers without making progress. Theodore, now commanding the Rough Riders since Colonel Wood had been promoted to brigade command, saw the situation deteriorating. He made a decision that was either brilliant or suicidal. He would lead a direct cavalry charge up Kettle Hill, drawing Spanish fire and hopefully rallying the stalled infantry units. He was one of the few Rough Riders who still had a horse, Little Texas, his favourite mount. He rode out in front of his men and began moving uphill toward the Spanish trenches. For several moments, Theodore was alone, the only mounted man moving toward the enemy, an impossible target. Spanish. Bullets whistled past him. His horse was not hit. He was not hit. Then the Rough Riders followed. They charged up the slope, screaming, firing as they advanced. Other American units, seeing the Rough Riders charging, joined the assault. The attack that had been failing suddenly gained momentum. The Spanish position on Kettle Hill was overrun. From there, Theodore led his men in an assault on San Juan Hill itself, arriving to find it already taken by other American units. The battle was a tactical victory, but a strategic mess. American casualties were heavy, more than 1,000 killed or wounded. The Spanish were dislodged from their positions, but the American army was in poor shape, suffering from tropical diseases and inadequate supplies. Theodore himself contracted malaria. But the hill had been taken, and Theodore Roosevelt had led a cavalry charge that became instantly famous. The press, which had reporters embedded with the American forces, sent dispatches back to the United States describing Roosevelt's heroism in glowing terms. Newspapers across the country ran stories about the Rough Riders' charge. Theodore became the most famous soldier in the war, overshadowing even the commanding generals. The war ended quickly. Spain sued for peace. Cuba became independent, though under American supervision. The United States acquired Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines as territories. America had become an imperial power, and Theodore Roosevelt had become a national hero. He returned to New York in August 1898 to find himself famous beyond anything he had imagined. He was mentioned as a potential candidate for governor of New York. The Republican Party bosses, who had once dismissed him as an irritating reformer, now saw him as a political asset. His war record made him electable, and electability mattered more than any lingering resentments about his earlier reform crusades. Theodore was nominated for governor and won the election in November 1898. He was 40 years old. He had been a state assemblyman, a civil service reformer, a police commissioner, a naval administrator, and a war hero. Now he would govern the largest state in the nation. But his time as governor would be brief, because the Republican Party was about to make a calculation that would accidentally put him one step away from the presidency. As governor of New York, Theodore drove the Republican Party bosses to distraction. He was supposed to be manageable now, tempered by political reality willing to compromise. Instead, he pushed for corporate regulation, labor protections, and conservation measures. He investigated corruption in canal construction projects. He taxed corporations more heavily. He was Theodore Roosevelt again, the reformer who would not be controlled. The party boss who suffered most was Senator Thomas Platt, the Republican machine leader who had supported Theodore's gubernatorial campaign expecting gratitude and cooperation. Instead, Platt found himself dealing with a governor who consulted him out of courtesy, but ignored his advice when it conflicted with Roosevelt's principles. By 1900, Platt wanted Roosevelt out of New York. The solution presented itself when Vice President Garrett Hobart died of heart disease in November 1899. President McKinley would need a new running mate for his re-election campaign. Platt conceived a plan: maneuver Roosevelt onto the national ticket. The vice presidency was traditionally a powerless office. Roosevelt would be removed from New York, neutralized politically, and unable to cause further problems for the state party organization. Theodore understood what was happening. He did not want the vice presidency. It was a dead end, a position of ceremonial duties and no real power. He wanted to continue as governor, to keep pushing his reform agenda. But the party machine was too strong. At the Republican National Convention in June 1900, Roosevelt was nominated for vice president by acclamation. He accepted because refusing would have meant the end of his political career. McKinley and Roosevelt won the election easily in November 1900. Theodore became vice president in March 1901 and immediately discovered that everyone had been right about the office. It was meaningless. He presided over the Senate, which meant sitting in a chair listening to speeches. He had no policy-making role. McKinley did not consult him on important decisions. He was a figurehead. Theodore was 42 years old, at the height of his energy and abilities, and he had been politically neutralized. He wrote to friends that his career was over, that he would serve out his term as vice president and then retire to private life. Perhaps he would write more books. Perhaps he would focus on his family. The great adventure was finished, and then, on September 6, 1901, President McKinley was shot. The president was attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, greeting visitors in a receiving line. A man named Leon Czolgosz approached with a gun hidden under a handkerchief. He fired twice at close range, hitting McKinley in the chest and abdomen. The president collapsed. Theodore was in Vermont speaking at a political event when he received word of the shooting. He rushed to Buffalo, arriving to find McKinley alive but gravely wounded. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. The president had survived the initial trauma. He seemed to be recovering. Theodore was told to return to his family vacation in the Adirondacks. There was nothing he could do in Buffalo. For several days the news remained encouraging. McKinley's condition appeared stable. Then, on September 13th, gangrene set in from the bullet wound. The infection spread rapidly. McKinley's condition deteriorated suddenly and catastrophically. Theodore was summoned urgently from the Adirondacks. He was hiking on Mount Marcy, the highest peak in New York, when a messenger found him. McKinley was dying. He needed to get to Buffalo immediately. Theodore descended the mountain in darkness, took a wild midnight carriage ride to the nearest train station, and raced toward Buffalo. He did not arrive in time. William McKinley died at 2:15 a.m. on September 14, 1901. Later that same day, in a private home in Buffalo, Theodore Roosevelt was sworn in as the 26th President of the United States. He was 42 years old, the youngest president in American history. The office that was supposed to end his career had instead elevated him to the pinnacle of American power. He took the oath with his hand on a Bible, surrounded by members of McKinley's cabinet and other officials. He pledged to continue McKinley's policies, to honor his predecessor's legacy, to provide continuity and stability. He said all the right things in that moment. But Theodore Roosevelt had not spent his entire life preparing to maintain the status quo. He was about to transform the American presidency into something it had never been before. Theodore Roosevelt's presidency began with a statement of continuity, but became an exercise in transformation. For the first time, the federal government would assert itself as a counterweight to corporate power. For the first time, conservation would become national policy. For the first time, the president would position the United States as a global power broker. Theodore remade not just policy, but the very concept of what a president could be. His first target was the trusts, the massive corporate monopolies that had come to dominate American economic life. Standard Oil controlled petroleum. The Sugar Trust controlled sugar refining. The Beef Trust controlled meat packing. J.P. Morgan's financial empire controlled railroads and steel production. These corporations operated with virtually no government oversight, crushing competitors, fixing prices, and accumulating wealth and power that rivaled sovereign nations. Previous presidents had largely left the trusts alone. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 existed on the books but was rarely enforced. The prevailing assumption was that government should not interfere with business. Theodore disagreed fundamentally. He believed that concentrated economic power was as dangerous as concentrated political power, and that the government had both the authority and the duty to regulate corporations in the public interest. In 1902, Theodore ordered his Attorney General to file suit against the Northern Securities Company, a railroad holding company created by J.P. Morgan, James J. Hill, and E.H. Harriman. The suit alleged that Northern Securities was an illegal monopoly that violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. Wall Street was stunned. Morgan himself travelled to Washington to negotiate with the president, expecting to work out a private arrangement as he had with previous administrations. The meeting became legendary. Morgan told Roosevelt, "If we have done anything wrong, send your man to my man and they can fix it up." Theodore replied that his administration did not work that way. The law would be enforced through the courts, not through backroom deals. Morgan left Washington realizing that this president was different. The Northern Securities case went to the Supreme Court, which ruled 5-4 in the government's favor in 1904. The monopoly was dissolved. Theodore had won. More importantly, he had established that the federal government could and would regulate corporate power. Over the next 7 years, his administration would file more than 40 antitrust suits, earning Roosevelt the nickname the Trust Buster. But Theodore did not oppose all large corporations. He distinguished between good trusts that served the public interest and bad trusts that exploited it. The distinction was subjective and inconsistent, but it reflected his pragmatic approach. He wanted to regulate corporate power, not destroy capitalism itself, labour relations presented another battlefield. In 1902, anthracite coal miners in Pennsylvania went on strike, demanding better wages, shorter hours, and recognition of their union. The mine owners refused to negotiate. As autumn approached and the prospect of a winter without coal loomed, the nation faced a crisis. Previous presidents had typically sided with owners during labour disputes, sending in troops to break strikes if necessary. Theodore invited both sides to Washington for negotiations. When the mine owners refused to make any concessions, Theodore threatened to send federal troops to seize the mines and operate them under government control. The owners, shocked by this unprecedented threat, agreed to arbitration. The strike was eventually settled, with the miners receiving a pay increase and reduced hours, though not union recognition. Theodore had done something remarkable. He had treated labour and capital as equal parties, entitled to equal consideration. He had not automatically sided with the owners. This even-handed approach earned him support from working-class voters, while demonstrating to corporate interests that this president could not be intimidated or controlled. Conservation became Theodore's most enduring domestic achievement. He loved wilderness, loved hunting and hiking, and believed passionately that natural resources needed protection for future generations. Previous presidents had done little to preserve public lands. Theodore would do more than all his predecessors combined. Working with his friend Gifford Pinchot, the chief of the U.S. Forest Service, Theodore used executive authority to establish 150 national forests, 5 national parks, and 18 national monuments. He created 51 federal bird sanctuaries and protected approximately 230 million acres of public land from development. When Congress tried to stop him from creating more forest reserves, Theodore responded by creating 21 new ones immediately before signing the bill that would have prevented him from doing so. The Grand Canyon, the California redwoods, vast stretches of western wilderness, all were preserved because Theodore believed that some landscapes were too important to be exploited for short-term profit. His conservation legacy remains visible today in America's national parks and forests. In foreign policy, Theodore embraced American imperialism without apology. He believed that the United States had emerged from the Spanish-American War as a world power and should act accordingly. His approach was summarized in a favorite proverb: "Speak softly and carry a big stick." America should pursue its interests diplomatically when possible, but always from a position of military strength. The Panama Canal became his most ambitious foreign policy project. A canal connecting the Atlantic and Pacific through Central America would revolutionize global shipping and project American naval power. The engineering challenges were immense. The political challenges were worse. Panama was a province of Colombia. The Colombian government refused to grant the United States acceptable terms for canal construction. Theodore's response was to support a Panamanian independence movement. In November 1903, with an American warship conveniently positioned offshore, Panama declared independence. The U.S. recognized the new nation within days. Within weeks, Panama granted the United States the right to build and control the canal. The entire operation was executed with a speed that left Colombia outraged, and international observers shocked at American heavy-handedness. Theodore was unrepentant. "I took Panama," he later declared, summarizing his approach to foreign policy. The canal construction began in 1904 and would continue through his presidency and beyond. When finished, it would be one of the great engineering achievements of the age and a symbol of American power. But Theodore also positioned himself as a peacemaker. When Russia and Japan went to war in 1904-1905. Theodore brokered peace negotiations, hosting both sides at Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The resulting Treaty of Portsmouth ended the war and earned Theodore the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906, making him the first American to receive the award. The fact that the same man who had charged up San Juan Hill and seized Panama was now being celebrated as a peacemaker captured the contradictions of his character. Throughout his presidency, Theodore remained the same exhausting personality he had always been. He gave endless speeches, often without notes, on topics ranging from corporate regulation to poetry to bird-watching. He wrote books while serving as president, biographies, natural history, political essays. He maintained an enormous correspondence, writing letters to friends, politicians, writers, scientists. His workday began early, often before 7 in the morning, and rarely ended before midnight. He read voraciously during every spare moment, consuming books at a rate that astonished everyone around him. He could read a book in a single evening and remember details from it weeks later during policy discussions. He boxed regularly until a blow detached a retina in his left eye during a sparring session with a young military officer in 1905. The injury left him partially blind, though he kept the extent of the damage secret for years, fearing it would make him appear weak. Rather than give up physical activity, he then switched to judo, studying with Yoshiaki Yamashita, a Japanese instructor who taught him in the White House. Theodore approached judo with his typical intensity, practicing regularly and earning respect from Yamashita for his dedication, if not his natural skill. He hiked Rock Creek Park with companions who struggled to keep up with the president's pace. The walks were legendary among Washington officials. Theodore called them point-to-point expeditions. The goal was to walk in a straight line from one point to another, regardless of obstacles. If a creek blocked the path, you waded through it. If a cliff appeared, you climbed it. If a fence stood in the way, you climbed over it. Cabinet secretaries and foreign ambassadors found themselves scrambling through brush, soaked to the skin, trying to keep pace with a president who saw no reason to slow down. He swam in the Potomac River in winter, breaking ice to reach the water. He rode horses through the White House grounds at speeds that terrified the staff. Visiting dignitaries were dragged on forced marches through Washington, expected to keep up with Theodore's relentless pace. The French ambassador Jules Jusserand reported breathlessly that Roosevelt had required him to climb over rocks and through streams during a diplomatic walk. When Jusserand expressed concern about getting his suit wet, Theodore suggested he simply remove it and wade through in his underwear, which is exactly what both men did. The ambassador later described this as one of the most unusual diplomatic experiences of his career. The president's energy was legendary and exhausting to everyone around him. His staff worked in shifts because no one could match Theodore's hours. Visitors to the White House reported that Roosevelt seemed to be everywhere at once, giving orders to staff, meeting with politicians, writing letters, reading reports, playing with his children, and somehow finding time to write books. His secretary estimated that Theodore dictated or wrote between 50 and 100 letters daily, on subjects ranging from affairs of state to advice for struggling authors to detailed ornithological observations. Theodore's curiosity was boundless and indiscriminate. He could discuss Sanskrit with scholars, military strategy with generals, the habits of North American birds with naturalists, and the latest developments in physics with scientists, all in the same day. His White House became a gathering place for intellectuals, artists, and athletes. The poet Edwin Arlington Robinson, the historian George Otto Trevelyan, the the naturalist John Burroughs, the sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens, champion prize-fighters and Olympic athletes, all found themselves dining at Roosevelt's table, subjected to his endless questions and passionate monologues on whatever subject currently fascinated him. His relationship with the press was revolutionary for the presidency. Previous presidents had maintained formal distance from reporters. Theodore invited journalists to the White House regularly, held informal conversations with them, and used them skillfully to shape public opinion. He understood that newspapers were crucial for building support for his policies, and he cultivated relationships with editors and reporters who could spread his message. When coverage turned negative, Theodore could be vindictive, freezing out critical journalists and directing federal patronage away from newspapers that opposed him. But mostly, the press loved him because he made excellent copy. A president who boxed, hunted, climbed rocks, and spoke in colourful language was endlessly interesting to readers. The White House itself underwent significant changes during Theodore's occupancy. The building had always mixed official government functions with the president's private residence in uncomfortable ways. Theodore oversaw a major renovation that created the West Wing as a separate space for the executive offices, freeing up the main building for the presidential family. He also began the tradition of calling the executive mansion the White House. Previous administrations had used various names, but Roosevelt consistently referred to it as the White House in correspondence, and the name stuck. His children turned the White House into something resembling a three-ring circus. Aside from the famous pony incident, they roller-skated through the halls, walked on stilts in the East Room, and slid down the grand staircase on trays, stolen from the kitchen. Secret Service agents charged with protecting the presidential family found themselves arbitrating disputes between children and occasionally being drafted into games that seemed designed to create as much chaos as possible. Archie once brought his pony Algonquin into the house to visit his sick brother Quentin, loading the animal into the White House elevator. When Theodore heard about it, he reportedly laughed until tears ran down his face. His family life was chaotic and warm. Sagamore Hill overflowed with children and noise during summer vacations. Theodore played with his children constantly, leading them on scrambles through the woods, reading to them in the evenings, teaching them to ride and shoot. The Roosevelt children grew up understanding that their father, despite being president, was accessible and engaged in ways that other fathers often were not. He wrote each child letters when he travelled, not perfunctory notes but real correspondence, full of stories and observations. When his younger son Quentin brought his pony into the White House elevator, Theodore thought it was hilarious. When Archie was ill, his brother Kermit smuggled Archie's pony upstairs to cheer him up. The president's household was like no other in American history. The Sagamore Hill estate became the summer White House, and the staff had to adapt to a level of activity that bore no resemblance to normal presidential operations. Telegraph wires were strung to the house. Newspaper reporters took up residence in the nearby village of Oyster Bay. Cabinet secretaries and foreign dignitaries made the trip from Washington or New York to conduct business on the sprawling porch overlooking Long Island Sound. Meanwhile, the Roosevelt children continued their usual activities, swimming, riding, shooting, and generally creating the kind of cheerful mayhem that Theodore encouraged. Theodore believed deeply in what he called the outdoor life. He wanted his children to be physically vigorous, mentally alert, and morally serious. He pushed them to develop skills and courage, but also showed them genuine affection and interest. When Theodore Jr. was bullied at school, Theodore did not simply tell his son to fight back. He hired boxing instructors for both of them and spent evenings sparring with his son, teaching him how to defend himself while also working out together as partners. When Kermit struggled academically, Theodore wrote him long letters about the importance of education, but also about how academic achievement was not the only measure of worth. When Ethel showed interest in literature, Theodore engaged her in detailed discussions about the books she was reading, treating her opinions with the same seriousness he would give an adult scholar. The family dinners at Sagamore Hill were raucous affairs, with Theodore dominating the conversation, but also encouraging the children to participate. He asked them questions, challenged their assumptions, told stories from history and natural history, and generally made dinner an educational experience disguised as entertainment. Guests who dined with the Roosevelts reported being astonished by the level of intellectual discourse and the freedom the children had to disagree with their father. Theodore had opinions about everything and expressed them forcefully, but he also respected genuine argument and thoughtful disagreement. Reading aloud was a nightly tradition. Theodore read to his children from a vast range of sources: adventure stories, poetry, history, natural history, Norse sagas, Greek myths, and Arthurian legends. He performed the readings dramatically, changing his voice for different characters, pausing to explain historical context or to discuss the moral implications of what they were reading. These sessions lasted for hours, with the younger children eventually falling asleep, while Theodore continued reading to the older ones. Many years later, his children would recall these reading sessions as among their most cherished memories of their father. But one child remained apart. Alice, Theodore's daughter from his first marriage, grew into a beautiful, rebellious young woman who smoked cigarettes, gambled, drove fast cars, and delighted in scandalizing Washington society. Theodore adored her, but could not control her. "I can do one of two things," he told a friend. "I can be President of the United States, or I can control Alice. I cannot possibly do both." Alice understood that she occupied a peculiar position in her father's heart. She was the living reminder of the wife he had loved and lost, the woman whose name he could not speak. She used this power, knowing that Theodore would forgive her behavior that he would never tolerate from his other children. She called him father to his face and mocked him behind his back. Their relationship was complex, loving, and never entirely resolved. Theodore won election in his own right in 1904, defeating Democrat Alton B. Parker by a landslide. But on election night, flush with victory, Theodore made a statement he would later regret. He pledged not to seek a third term. The tradition of a two-term limit, established by Washington and followed by all subsequent presidents, would constrain him. He would serve until March 1909, then step aside. As his presidency continued, Theodore grew more progressive in his politics. He called for income and inheritance taxes, for stricter corporate regulation, for expanded federal power over economic matters. Conservative Republicans in Congress increasingly resisted his agenda. Theodore responded by appealing directly to the public, using his popularity to pressure legislators. He pioneered what would later be called the bully pulpit, using the presidency as a platform to shape public opinion and drive political change. But by 1908, Theodore had promised not to run again, and unlike later presidents, he felt bound by that promise. He handpicked his successor, William Howard Taft, his Secretary of War and close friend. Taft was nominated at the Republican Convention and elected in November 1908. Theodore prepared to leave office, confident that Taft would continue his policies. He was catastrophically wrong. The relationship between Roosevelt and Taft would end in betrayal, and the consequences would reshape American politics for a generation. On March 4th, 1909, Theodore Roosevelt attended William Howard Taft's inauguration, then boarded a ship for Africa. He was 50 years old, exhausted from 7 years of relentless presidential activity and ready for adventure. He'd arranged a hunting expedition to East Africa, combining his lifelong passion for natural history with his need for physical challenge. For the next year, he would kill elephants, lions, and rhinoceroses, collect thousands of specimens for the Smithsonian Institution, and try not to think about American politics. This safari was everything Theodore had dreamed. He hunted across British East Africa, camping in the wilderness, shooting dangerous game and filling journals with observations about African wildlife. His son Kermit accompanied him, and the two bonded over shared experiences of danger and discovery. Theodore shot 9 lions, 5 elephants, 13 rhinoceroses, 7 hippopotamuses, and dozens of other animals. The specimens he collected filled entire railroad cars when shipped back to the United States. From Africa, Theodore moved on to Europe, where he was received like a reigning monarch. He gave lectures at Oxford and Cambridge. He met with the King of England, the Kaiser of Germany, the President of France. European leaders treated him with a respect they rarely showed American politicians. Theodore delighted in the attention while maintaining his American informality, refusing to bow or address royalty with formal titles. But while Theodore was shooting lions and dining with kings, his friendship with Taft was collapsing back home. The new president was not continuing Roosevelt's policies. He was reversing them. Taft was firing Roosevelt's appointees, including Gifford Pinchot, the forestry chief who'd been Theodore's closest ally on conservation. He was settling antitrust cases on terms favourable to corporations. He was aligning himself with the conservative wing of the Republican Party. Progressive Republicans were outraged. They flooded Theodore with letters begging him to return and save the party from Taft's betrayal. Theodore, travelling through Europe, tried to stay above the fray. He had chosen Taft. He had trusted his friend to continue the work they had started together. He did not want to believe that trust had been misplaced. He returned to the United States in June 1910 to a reception that demonstrated his continued popularity. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the streets of New York to welcome him home. He remained the most famous and beloved figure in American politics despite being out of office. But he also returned to find the Republican Party in open warfare between progressives and conservatives, with Taft firmly on the conservative side. Theodore tried to remain neutral, tried to avoid criticizing his former friend, but his nature would not allow silence. By late 1910, he was giving speeches calling for a new nationalism, an expanded vision of federal power that went beyond even his own presidential agenda. He called for more aggressive regulation of corporations, a graduated income tax, direct election of senators, and women's suffrage. The speeches made clear that Theodore believed the Republican Party under Taft had abandoned progressive reform. The final break came in 1912. Progressive Republicans, convinced that Taft was leading the party to disaster, begged Theodore to challenge him for the nomination. Theodore resisted for months. He had left office voluntarily. Returning to challenge his own hand-picked successor seemed like betrayal. But progressives kept pressing, and Theodore's ego could not resist. He announced his candidacy in February 1912 with a famous declaration, "My hat is in the ring." The campaign that followed was vicious. Taft, who genuinely loved Theodore and had idolized him for years, felt betrayed by his mentor's challenge. Theodore saw Taft's presidency as a betrayal of everything they had worked for. Former friends became enemies. The Republican primary turned into a battle between the ex-president and the incumbent president, with progressive delegates supporting Roosevelt and party regulars backing Taft. Theodore won most of the primary votes in states that held them, but Taft controlled the party machinery. At the Republican National Convention in Chicago, the Credentials Committee, controlled by Taft's supporters, awarded disputed delegates to the president. Theodore's supporters claimed fraud. The convention became chaotic, with Roosevelt delegates shouting protests and walking out. Taft won renomination, but the party was shattered. Theodore's supporters immediately formed a new party, the Progressive Party, nicknamed the Bull Moose Party, after Theodore declared himself as fit as a bull moose. In August 1912, the Progressive Party held its own convention and nominated Roosevelt for president on a platform calling for sweeping social reforms, women's suffrage, direct democracy, worker protections, social insurance, and aggressive corporate regulation. Theodore campaigned with his usual intensity despite being 53 years old. He crisscrossed the country, giving speech after speech, attacking both Taft and the Democratic nominee Woodrow Wilson. He was confident he could win. The crowds that greeted him everywhere seemed to confirm that the public still loved Theodore Roosevelt. On October 14, 1912, in Milwaukee, a man named John Schrank shot Theodore Roosevelt at close range. Theodore was about to enter an auditorium to give a speech when Schrank pushed through the crowd and fired a revolver into Theodore's chest. The bullet struck Roosevelt's chest, penetrated his glasses case and the folded manuscript of his speech in his coat pocket, and lodged in his chest muscle. Theodore staggered but did not fall. His aides wanted to rush him to a hospital. Theodore refused. He coughed into his hand, checked for blood, and determined that the bullet had not penetrated his lung. Therefore, he decided, the injury was not life-threatening. He would give his scheduled speech. What followed became one of the most famous moments of Theodore's life. He walked onto the stage, opened his coat to show the blood-stained shirt beneath, and told the shocked audience, "Friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I've just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." He then delivered a 90-minute speech while bleeding from a chest wound. The manuscript he pulled from his pocket had a bullet hole through it. Theodore showed it to the audience, made jokes about the assassination attempt, and proceeded to give his planned address about progressive reform. Doctors later said the folded manuscript had probably saved his life by slowing the bullet. When he finally finished speaking and went to the hospital, the doctors decided it was safer to leave the bullet in place than to operate. Theodore survived, but the assassination attempt did not help his campaign. His recuperation took him off the trail for crucial weeks. The divided Republican vote between Taft and Roosevelt allowed Wilson to win the presidency with less than 42% of the popular vote. Theodore came in second, outpolling Taft, but it was not enough. The Progressive Party had demonstrated that reform had a constituency, but it had also ensured Democratic victory. After the election, Theodore fell into a depression. He had lost. He had split his party. His political career was over. He was 54 years old, and for the first time in decades he had no clear purpose. He needed another adventure, something to pull him out of the darkness. He found it in the Amazon rainforest, and it nearly killed him. In December 1913, Theodore embarked on an expedition to explore an unmapped tributary of the Amazon River in Brazil. The river was called the Rio da Dúvida, the River of Doubt. It had never been navigated by outsiders, and its course was unknown. The Brazilian government invited Theodore to join an expedition to map the river and collect natural history specimens. Theodore accepted immediately. The expedition was a disaster almost from the beginning. The river was far longer and more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The party faced starvation as their food supplies ran low. The rapids were brutal, destroying canoes and drowning supplies. The jungle teemed with insects, snakes, and disease. Several members of the expedition fell, ill with tropical fevers. Theodore himself developed a leg infection after cutting his leg on a rock while trying to save a canoe from capsizing. In the damp, unsanitary conditions of the jungle, the wound became infected. The infection spread, and Theodore developed a raging fever. His temperature soared to 105 degrees. He became delirious, reciting poetry and ranting about imaginary enemies. He told his son Kermit to leave him behind and save themselves. Kermit refused. The expedition struggled onward, carrying Theodore when he could not walk, supporting him through rapids, fighting to keep him alive. Theodore insisted they leave him to die, convinced he was slowing them down fatally. Kermit threatened to stay behind with his father if the others left, forcing them to continue together. They emerged from the jungle in April 1914, all sick, starving and exhausted. Theodore had lost 55 pounds. He would never fully recover his health. The jungle fever returned periodically for the rest of his life. The leg infection left him with a permanent limp. The man who had spent his life building his body had pushed it too far, and now it was breaking down irreversibly. But he had mapped the river. The Rio da Duvida was renamed Rio Roosevelt in his honor. His expedition had added a significant geographic discovery to his resume. For Theodore, that achievement justified the cost. He returned to the United States to find the world changing in ways he had not anticipated. In Europe, the assassination of an Austrian archduke had triggered a crisis that would explode into the First World War. Theodore would spend the remaining years of his life watching that war, increasingly frustrated that America was not involved, increasingly angry at President Wilson for maintaining neutrality. When war broke out in Europe in August 1914, Theodore believed that America should immediately enter on the side of Britain and France. Germany's invasion of neutral Belgium violated international law and basic morality in Theodore's view, and American honor demanded a response. President Wilson's policy of neutrality infuriated him. Theodore began giving speeches attacking Wilson's cowardice, calling for military preparedness and eventual American intervention. The German sinking of the Lusitania in May 1903, killing over 1,000 civilians, including 128 Americans, should have brought American entry, Theodore believed. When Wilson continued to pursue diplomacy rather than war, Theodore's attacks grew more vitriolic. He called Wilson a coward, questioned his manhood, and accused him of betraying American honor. The attacks were personal and ugly, reflecting Theodore's genuine belief that Wilson's neutrality was morally wrong, but also Theodore's frustration at being sidelined. He was 56 years old in 1914, too old to fight himself, but desperate to be relevant to the great crisis of his time. The Amazon expedition had broken his health. His political career was over. The war was the last great adventure he could not join, and it tormented him. When America finally entered the war in April 1917, Theodore immediately volunteered to raise a division of volunteers and lead them to France. He was 58 years old, half blind, limping from his leg infection, weakened by recurring jungle fever. He was clearly unfit for military service, but Theodore genuinely believed he could still lead men in combat, could still charge up a hill as he had done at San Juan. President Wilson refused his request. The rejection was sensible. Theodore was too old and too sick, but it was also personal. Wilson and Roosevelt hated each other, and Wilson took evident pleasure in denying his predecessor's plea. Theodore would not fight in the war, but his sons would. Theodore Jr., Kermit, Archie and Quentin all entered military service. Theodore was proud and terrified. He'd raised his boys to believe in the strenuous life, to value courage and duty above safety. Now they would test those values in the trenches of France, and Theodore understood that some might not return. In July 1918, the telegram arrived that Theodore had been dreading. Quentin, his youngest son, had been shot down over France while flying combat missions. He was 20 years old. His plane had crashed behind German lines. Quentin was dead. The loss broke something in Theodore that even the Amazon had not destroyed. Quentin had been the baby, the most playful of the children, the one who brought his pony into the White House elevator. Theodore had loved all his children, but Quentin occupied a special place. Now he was dead, buried in France, killed fighting in the war that Theodore had spent years demanding America join. Theodore received the news with characteristic public stoicism. He issued a statement praising his son's sacrifice and affirming that Quentin had died serving his country. But privately, Edith and his surviving children saw the devastation. Theodore seemed to age years in days. The energy that had driven him for 6 decades was simply gone. His health, already compromised by the Amazon expedition, deteriorated further. The jungle fever returned more frequently. He suffered from rheumatism, from inflammatory rheumatism, from infections that would not heal. He spent increasing time in bed, unable to maintain the relentless activity that had defined his life. But Theodore continued working almost to the end. He wrote articles attacking Wilson's plans for the League of Nations after the war. He plotted a return to politics, believing he could win the Republican nomination in 1920 and defeat Wilson or his successor. Friends who visited Sagamore Hill in late 1918 reported that Theodore still talked about the future, still made plans, still refused to acknowledge that his body was failing. On January 5, 1919, Theodore spent the day with Edith. They talked about their children, about politics, about plans for the future. His last conversation with Edith concerned whether he should accept an invitation to speak at the American Museum of Natural History. He was tired, he admitted, but he thought he should fulfill the commitment. That night, Theodore went to bed at his usual time. Edith checked on him before she retired. He was sleeping peacefully. She went to her own room and slept. At 4:15 in the morning, she woke to find him breathing strangely. By the time help arrived, Theodore Roosevelt was dead. A blood clot had travelled from his leg to his lung, stopping his heart. He was 60 years old. His last words, spoken to Edith earlier that evening, had been about plans, about continuing work, about what came next. Theodore had died as he had lived, making plans for action he would not live to complete. Vice President Thomas Marshall, when informed of Roosevelt's death, said, "Death had to take him sleeping, for if Roosevelt had been awake, there would have been a fight." The funeral was held at Christ Church in Oyster Bay on January 8, 1919. 500 people attended, filling the church to capacity. Theodore had requested a simple service. No eulogies, no speeches, just hymns and prayers. He was buried in a small cemetery near Sagamore Hill, his grave marked by a simple headstone bearing only his name and dates. The nation mourned. Flags flew at half-mast. Newspapers ran tributes acknowledging that something essential had been lost. Whatever one thought of Theodore Roosevelt's politics or his personality, everyone agreed that he had been a force of nature, a man of such energy and vitality that his death seemed impossible. The editorial in the New York Times captured the sense of loss. Never again will there be a man quite like him, because the conditions that produced him have passed. He was the last great American of the heroic type. The assessments began immediately. Theodore Roosevelt had been president for 7.5 years. He had regulated corporations, conserved natural resources, brokered international peace agreements, and reshaped the presidency into an active force for change. He had expanded American power globally, built the Panama Canal, and sent the Great White Fleet around the world. He'd written 35 books, given thousands of speeches read voraciously, and maintained an enormous correspondence with people around the world. But he had also split his party in 1912, helping to elect Wilson and sideline progressive Republicans for years. His imperialism, celebrated in his own time, would later be viewed with skepticism. His racial views, typical of his era, were nonetheless troubling even by the standards of 1919. His belief in military valor and martial honor would seem increasingly anachronistic as the horrors of modern warfare became apparent. Theodore's children would carry his legacy forward in various ways. Alice would live until 1980, becoming a sharp-tongued fixture of Washington society, beloved for her wit and her willingness to say what everyone else only thought. Theodore Jr. would serve in World War II and die of a heart attack after the D-Day landings, having earned the Medal of Honor for his actions on Utah Beach. Kermit would die by suicide during World War II, struggling with alcoholism and depression. Ethel, Archibald, and their descendants would work in various capacities to preserve and promote their father's legacy. Edith would live until 1948, spending her remaining years at Sagamore Hill, preserving Theodore's memory and his papers. She would see the house become a national historic site, ensuring that future generations could visit the home where the Roosevelt family had lived and laughed and raised their children. The 20th century would be shaped by Theodore Roosevelt in ways both obvious and subtle. The modern presidency, with its expectation of executive action and its use of the office as a bully pulpit, descends directly from Theodore's innovations. The national park system, now visited by hundreds of millions of people annually, exists because of his conservation efforts. The Panama Canal, still one of the world's most important waterways, was his achievement. The progressive movement, though it would take different forms under different leaders, drew inspiration from his battles against corporate power. But perhaps Theodore's most important legacy was his demonstration that physical limitations need not be destiny. This sickly child who could not breathe became the embodiment of vigorous life. The boy who had to make his body show generations of Americans that willpower and determination could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. His life was an argument for action over resignation, for engagement over passivity, for the belief that individuals could shape their own fate through effort and courage. Critics would point out correctly that Theodore's circumstance, his wealth, his family connections, his privilege, made his achievements easier than they would have been for someone born without those advantages. A poor child with severe asthma in the 1860s would likely have died young, not grown up to become president. Theodore's transformation was possible partly because he had resources that most people lacked. But the inspiration remained valid even if the circumstances were exceptional. Theodore showed that the worst thing that could happen to you, chronic illness, the death of a loved one, political defeat, need not define you. That you could face devastating loss and somehow continue. That you could be knocked down and get back up. That a life fully lived with courage and determination and joy, was possible even for those who began with significant disadvantages. He lived large, he loved deeply, he fought fiercely for what he believed. He made mistakes, sometimes terrible ones, and he accomplished extraordinary things. He was brilliant and exasperating, inspiring and exhausting, progressive and imperialistic, compassionate and ruthless. He was, in short, fully and completely human, with all the contradictions that humanity entails. If you have found this journey through Theodore Roosevelt's life moving or illuminating, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know in the comments which aspect of Theodore's life resonated most with you. His transformation from sickly child to vigorous adult, his political battles, his conservation legacy, or something else entirely. Theodore Roosevelt died believing his life's work was incomplete. He wanted to serve another presidential term. He wanted to see the League of Nations formed properly. He wanted to live long enough to help shape the post-war world. Death took him before he could accomplish these final ambitions. But measured by any reasonable standard, Theodore Roosevelt's life was not incomplete. He achieved more than most people could accomplish in several lifetimes. He left the nation and the world changed by his presence, and he demonstrated through sheer force of personality and determination that one person committed to vigorous action could indeed make a profound difference. The boy who had to make his body made himself into a force that would reshape America. The young man who lost everything and fled to the Dakota Badlands found a way to continue living after devastating loss. The police commissioner who walked the midnight streets of New York and the president who broke corporate monopolies was the same person. Someone who believed that the powerful had obligations to those with less power, that privilege carried duties, that comfort and safety were less important than living according to your principles. He was imperfect, as all people are, but he was authentic. Theodore Roosevelt never pretended to be something he was not. He was exactly himself, completely and without apology, from his first breath in 1858 to his last in 1919. The grave in Oyster Bay is simple, as Theodore requested. No monument, no elaborate memorial, just a headstone with his name. Visitors come throughout the year to pay respects, to remember the man who charged up San Juan Hill, who saved the Grand Canyon, who coined the phrase "speak softly and carry a big stick," who lived so intensely that 60 years seemed to contain several lifetimes. Near the grave, you can walk the trails through the woods where Theodore hiked with his children. Sagamore Hill still stands, preserved as it was when the Roosevelt family lived there. You can see Theodore's study, where he wrote his books and conducted the nation's business during summers. You can see the trophy room, filled with the heads of animals he shot on 3 continents. You can see the nursery where his children played and the porch where he sat with Edith in the evenings. But the best memorial to Theodore Roosevelt is not in Oyster Bay. It is in the national parks he saved, where millions of Americans hike and camp and experience the wilderness he fought to preserve. It is in the progressive reforms he championed, many of which, worker protections, corporate regulations, conservation laws, remain part of American governance. It is in the presidency itself, which was transformed by his occupancy into something more active, more engaged, more connected to the American people than it had been before. And perhaps it is in every person who faces overwhelming obstacles and refuses to surrender, who decides that they will make themselves into something more than their circumstances suggest is possible, who chooses action over resignation. Theodore Roosevelt's spirit lives wherever people fight against limitations, internal or external, and refuse to accept that they cannot achieve something meaningful. The light that went out in 1919 had burned so brightly that we can still see by its glow more than a century later. The sickly child became the vigorous man, the heartbroken widower became the loving husband and father, the idealistic reformer became the effective president, the enthusiastic amateur naturalist became the conservationist who saved millions of acres of wilderness. He was all of these things and more, a person so fully alive that death seemed like an imposition, an interruption of a story that should have continued forever. But all stories end. Theodore Roosevelt ended in the early morning of January 6, 1919, when his great heart finally stopped. He slept, and in sleeping he slipped away without the fight his friends expected. Perhaps it was fitting. The man who had fought everything and everyone for 60 years had earned, at the last, a peaceful departure. Until our next journey into history, I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Theodore Roosevelt lived large. May we all find the courage to live fully in whatever ways are available to us.